So I'm just going to push the car into the garage a little bit more using these skates. And I'm just going to have a look at this VIN number and see if I can work out what engine is actually fitted to this Peugeot 207cc. And I think I've got it. So looking at the numbers on the VIN, I think I'm correct in identifying this engine as the EP6DT, or the numbers are actually 5FXC, and that is for the 1.6 THP, which is turbo high pressure, 16 valve, 150 brake horsepower. So knowing that, I did have a suspicion that's probably what the engine was. There's a lot on the internet on these engines, and it's not good news. I haven't seen any good news really. So they have three main problems. Well, I suppose the first thing, a bit about the engine. It was, I think it was named the Prince, and it was a joint venture between Peugeot, Citroën, or PSA, and BMW. So it's a very popular engine. It's in a lot of cars. It's in the Mini. I think it's in the BMW 1 Series. It's in a lot of cars. And there's three main issues. I say main because you could probably, the list is probably endless. But the three main ones are the tensioner on the timing chain can clog, I believe, if it's had lack of service. That can clog and then not put the right amount of tension on the chain. Also, the spring can get weak over time, and obviously with either of those it means the chain could jump a tooth and timing go out. The other thing is the actual crank and the camshaft can slip, and when I read that I thought, well, it can't slip, they're always keyed, aren't they? They always have a little keyway in there, it's physically locked. Now, from what I've read, they're not physically locked, they're actually just torqued to a certain tightness and held. And rumour has it that they weren't torqued sufficiently at the factory, they didn't quite get that torque figure correct, and it can possibly actually slip. Obviously, if the timing slips, you've got the risk of the piston whopping the valve, bending a valve, and the rest of it. So, and the third thing obviously is because it's a direct injection engine, they always suffer from sooty inlet valves because of the recirculation system, the emissions, and petrol being injected directly into the cylinder, whereas before it used to be injected into the ports, and that would sort of wash the ports, keep it clean. But obviously with direct injection, nothing cleans the ports now, so they soot up and the engine basically chokes, and I think you can clean that with walnut blasting or something like that. So I think my first port of call on this will be, I've not started the engine or attempted it on the assumption the timing's out, and then I could do further damage. So I think what I'll do is I'll take the wheel off, try and turn the crank by hand, and just see if the engine actually will physically go round, or whether we're going to get it stop part way because it's obviously hit a valve. I'm hoping that's not the case. Like I said, I've not worked on one of these engines before, so this is a first for me. Could prove quite interesting. So, time to remove the road wheel and rotate the crank. So it's now time to jack the car up and see if we can get this wheel off. Now, problem number one. The locking wheel nut appears to be damaged. It actually seems to be quite a poor design. Here's some photos of it. And as you can see, there's 4 hardened pins, and those have been rounded off. So it's not going to work very well. So what I can try is this impact screwdriver. I bought this many years ago, back in the 90s, from RS. And hopefully this will shake things up enough. And thankfully we get some movement, because that could have been a real problem. A broken locking wheel nut is always a bit of a nightmare. So a bit of a sigh there of relief, and that ain't going back in tight. Okay, so onto the actual wheel now. We'll get that skate out of the way, and I'm going to use air impact on this just to be quicker. So that's a 17mm impact socket for the road wheels, and as you can see, things are certainly a bit rusty in there. It's been a while. Anyway, so we'll take this inner splash panel out. So that's, I'm using a trim removing tool there just to pop those off, and it does look like underneath that we've got a panel that's been sliced away, probably with some sort of cutting disc, because it's melted the edge. I have no idea why they would have cut that away like that. Bit of a shame, but anyway, so we'll try and get these out. So this is 10mm sockets for the remains of that splash guard. It's probably a guard to prevent stones and that hitting the pulley belts. That's what it appears to be. So again, trim removing tool there, just to get those bits off. There's another little popper there at the front. That's just off camera. And this one here on the side. So that's all loose. So I think this is a Torx 15. One screw. It's a bit odd, just one screw, but there we go. And I think there's a couple of little plastic clips on the left hand side. Yeah, one down there. Pop that out. And I think there's another one at the back. Yep. The trim tools do tend to get those out quite nicely, because you can just pop the head off it like that and then lever the rest out. Okay, so that's the trim coming out now. And this is all to gain access to the crank. So I can just rotate this engine by hand as a bit of a safety precaution. Okay, so that's out of the way now. Now let's have a look at this crank. So just before we turn this crank, let's have a look at some of these pulleys. So we've got a coolant pump pulley that is driven by a water pump drive friction wheel to the crankshaft pulley. We also have an automatic belt tensioner, and there's the alternator in the top right hand corner, and bottom right is the air conditioning compressor pulley. And while we're at it, we might have a quick look underneath the car. There's a lot of bracing bars there, presumably because it's the cabriolet, and we can see the oil sump and the plug, the gearbox and various other components. Okay, so back on with where we were. So I've got a big extension bar here, and using an 18mm socket, you can hear the belt sort of doesn't sound very healthy, that belt, but then it's been stuck there for over a year. But the engine is actually turning. But then if the valve was bent, I presume it could probably still turn once the damage is done. So that still doesn't tell us whether it's broken. Anyway, I'm going to try and start the engine now and see what happens. So I'm going to try and start her now and see what happens. She nearly fired. It's going to start, isn't it? But then that could still do that even if there was damage inside, because perhaps one of the cylinders fired. So I speed this part up, and then she's not going to start again. There's no attempt. So I think my best thing to do now is probably a compression test. So I'll put the wheel back on, and tomorrow I'll have a go at doing a compression test. So I'm just going to spray a little bit of plus gas on all these nuts and bolts, just in case I end up having to take them off later on. So it might just make life a little bit easier. So we'll get that wheel on, get the old mud out from underneath, and lower it down, ready for a compression test. And we get that battery back on charge, I think. I realised I probably should have checked the error codes before doing the compression test, but I was convinced the timing had slipped. So I want to disconnect a couple of fuses, the first one being to the fuel pump, and that is fuse 5, rated at 15 amps. And also I want to disconnect the ignition coils, and that appears to be fuse 10, and that fuse is rated at 30 amps. So here is an overview of the fuse box, and we're interested in removing fuse 5, which is blue and 15 amps, and fuse 10, which is green and 30 amps. Though looking at my fuse box, it appears that 3 of the fuses might actually be the wrong type of fuse. So we just need to pop the fuse box cover off. This is the engine fuse box. There is another one in the passenger footwell. Now ideally you would use a pair of plastic tweezers that are normally supplied in some fuse boxes, but I couldn't find any readily to hand, so I'm using a pair of metal bent nose pliers, but there is a risk of shorting things out, so metal is not the best. So that's the 15 amp fuse out, and then I'm just going to pull this green 30 amp out as well. So hopefully when we run the compression tests we won't have the coil packs or the fuel pump running. Now to remove the air filter and the coil packs. So when doing a compression test they normally advise you remove the air filter to ensure that the maximum amount of air can get to the cylinder. So we'll just remove the upper housing of the air filter like so. And that was done with a Torx 25 and a 7mm socket. We can now focus on removing the connections to the coil packs or the ignition coils. For some reason these were very tight on mine, so I actually had to lever them out. I wouldn't have thought you'd actually need to lever those off, but for some reason I needed to. I thought perhaps as you lift it up it would automatically sort of push it off. But anyway, so just go disconnect all 4 of those, and then hopefully just pull the coil packs out. Apart from cylinder number 1 wasn't just going to pull out. So my idea here was that if I used a small 2-inch G-clamp I could put it on the outside plastic to stop it popping off. That would keep that plastic piece stuck on there. I should be able to then just pull on the ring pull on it. That was cutting into my fingers, so it's still that tight it was cutting in. But the G-clamp did work. Now I noticed this one seemed to be a bit different. So those had sort of a metal outer case, and this one seemed to have a rubber outer case. So I'll have a look at that in a bit more detail later on. But that's how they do, they pop off. So if you pull too hard, that will just pop off. So that's what the G-clamp was being used for, just to hold that in position. That's how they should come out, with a nice little pop. And again. So we've definitely got one coil pack that seems to be a bit different. So is there a size difference? So this is what I would think was the genuine one, and that's 25.91 millimeters diameter. And then this one, the tight one, is about a millimeter wider. That might explain why it didn't want to come out. Onto the spark plugs, using a 14mm spark plug socket. So normally I blow the tubes out where the spark plugs go, just in case there's any grit in there. I then undo the spark plug 1 or 2 revolutions and then give it another blow. This is to ensure that no grit or anything can fall into the cylinder when I actually remove the spark plug. So it's just an extra precaution. So we're looking for a light brown to grey colour on the spark plugs, which would indicate correct combustion. And I think that would be called light brown to grey. So hopefully the engine is actually running correctly. Sadly the light didn't actually help. It sort of bleached it out a bit. Now one of the cylinder number 2 did have a bit of an issue. It didn't want to come up on the socket. So sometimes you might need one of those little magnetic retrievers like that, just to bring it back up. So that's got a little bit of thread damage there. Bit concerning that can be, because they're only an aluminium cylinder head, so you don't really want any damage to the thread. But anyway, the spark plugs I think are looking okay, so we'll carry on. So I'm just going to keep the coil packs and the corresponding spark plugs together and in the order that they came out of the engine, just for future reference. We can pop those to one side now. Now onto the compression test itself. Now I'm just going to put a little squirt of engine oil into each of the cylinders. This will give them a better seal while I do the compression test, just that I get maximum compression. And also, because the battery is probably quite old and tired, I'm going to put an extra battery on there as well. Again, to give it maximum ability to give me the top compression, so that hopefully I get the best of what it can give. So I'm just going to label the cylinders as well, so there's no confusion, because cylinder 1 is next to the gearbox on the Peugeot, and normally cylinder 1 would be next to the timing chain. I nearly got caught out with this because I didn't actually have a 12mm adapter with this compression tester, because it's a bit old. So thankfully I had one in a leak down test kit and was able to fit that instead. So anyway, so let's see what we've got for cylinder number 1. Trying to see the gauge there. Compression's definitely going up nicely. And that's looking pretty good. 185 psi. No complaints there. So, what's cylinder number 2 going to be? If we've got a bent valve, we're going to have no compression at all on one of these cylinders, which is obviously my fear. Okay, so let's go into cylinder number 2 and see what we get on this. So we have got compression. It's stopping at 150. And it's had enough at 150. That is 35 psi though lower than cylinder number 1, which isn't so good. That's quite a bit of a difference. I think it's only supposed to be something like 10 psi between the cylinders. So that is quite a bit. But we've got compression, which is the main thing. Okay then, so cylinder number 3. See what we've got on this one. Good, we've got compression. It's not too bad. That's 175 psi. So that's more like it. That's only a difference of 10 psi. So that's good news. So lastly, cylinder number 4. So hopefully there's compression. Okay then, here goes. Oh, look at that face. No! What is going on with that face? Please concentrate on the gauge, which is good news, 185 psi. That made up for the funny face there. That was pretty scary. So that's the same as cylinder number 1. So it's only really cylinder number 2 that had a bit of a quirk there. So compression seems to be okay. The mystery continues then. So now to pop the spark plugs back in. So just for information, I thought I'd photograph the spark plug that was in my car, and then we can see some details on these spark plugs. So although it's a 12mm spark plug, it's actually undone with a 14mm socket. So the 12mm actually refers to the thread size, which is an M12. And the official length of the thread is 26.5mm. And finally, its overall length is 83.89mm. So it's 23 Newton meters for the torque setting, and you have to be very careful when putting the spark plugs back in. I sort of turn them anti-clockwise, then clockwise, just to make sure they're actually seated correctly. Because the last thing you want to do is cross-thread one of these with a soft aluminium head. Sometimes you can use like a tube, and if you just pop a piece of tube on the end of the spark plug and use that just to feel for the spark plug to gently go in. But anyway, so we'll get these spark plugs now in. We've got number 1 in. This is supposed to be magnetic and hold them in place, and yet for some reason it keeps dropping them. So 23 Newton meters on each one. It's not a lot, and it would be very easy to strip the thread in a cylinder head, and then that really would give you some problems. And then lastly, the one that doesn't really fit very well. And so that's back on. So we just need to do the air filter now. So air filter to go back in. So we just pop that element back in. Thankfully that looks pretty clean. Pop the cover back on. It's pretty awkward in there because you have got to sort of, you can't see what it's like at the back. You've just got to poke around and hope it fits on, and then get that pipe back on. And then we just need to tighten those up like so, and then pop those 2 fuses back in. So get those in, and then I'll start the car and just check that it's still turning over and that things aren't worse than when I first started. So let's give it a quick spin over. Almost wants to start. It sort of fires, and then somebody with a bit more experience would have this sorted straight away. They'd know exactly what was wrong. But for me, it's going to be a little bit of a trip. So this was a cold compression test on a Peugeot 207, and thank you for watching, and hope this video helps you do a compression test if ever you need to. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in March 2021. I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.